everyone. Welcome to our discussion of the current Turkish operations going on in Syria. My name is Mary Chapman. I am Manager of Client Communications at WorldAware. I will be your moderator for the briefing. All attendees are currently muted and will be muted throughout the briefing. Please hold questions until the end. I would now like to introduce Jim Duck. Jim is a Watch Operations Manager at WorldAware. He's also one of our Europe analysts on our European team. He is a 30-year veteran of the U.S. intelligence community, serving as a senior linguist, analyst, and intelligence team manager at the National Security Agency. Jim is going to provide an overview of what's happening between Turkey and Kurdish forces in Syria and how it could impact your organization. Jim?
Thank you, Mary. Okay, as we are already all very well aware, for a number of years now, U.S. troops have been on the ground in northeastern Syria, allied with the faction known as the Syrian Democratic Forces, or SDF, in the fight against Islamic State. The ethnic Kurdish People's Protection Units, or YPG, the military wing of the Kurdish Democratic Union Party, constitute the main contingent within the SDF. While the U.S.-Kurdish alliance has been a key factor in the defeat of Islamic State in Syria, it has also come at an important cost in the form of friction between the United States and NATO partner Turkey, which considers the YPG a terrorist organization and a threat to its national security. The reason for Ankara's position is that the Kurdish Democratic Union Party was formed in 2003 as an offshoot of the Kurdistan Workers' Party, known more commonly as the PKK, an organization that has been engaged in the decades-long armed insurgency in Turkey's southeastern provinces, and which is recognized by several nations as a terror group. Now, it was against this backdrop that on October 6, following a phone conversation with Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan, U.S. President Donald Trump ordered the withdrawal of American troops in northeastern Syria, effectively ending the alliance with the Kurds. Only 3 days later, on October 9 at 4 p.m., Turkey launched a new military offensive in northern Syria, codenamed Operation Fountain of Peace, with Turkish forces and their Free Syrian Army allies moving east of the Euphrates River. The main objective of this operation is to force Kurdish fighters from the area and establish a 20-mile or 30-kilometer wide so-called safety zone. Since the start of the Turkish operation, the situation has become more complex as Kurdish fighters quickly concluded a deal with Damascus for Syrian government troops to deploy in the border region, bringing with them an unknown number of allied Russian troops to fill the void left by the departing Americans and help thwart the Turkish offensive. But let's go ahead and take a closer look at this situation's potential implications for organizations operating in Turkey from a more practical standpoint. And we'll go through a number of primary concerns. First off, what's the potential for heightened terror activity in Turkey by the PKK? Well, for obvious reasons, the U.S. withdrawal and subsequent Turkish military offensive has left the Kurdish People's Protection Units and the Kurdish inhabitants of the region in general feeling betrayed and abandoned by Washington. Now, this situation would seem, well, on the surface at least actually, to provide motivation for groups operating within Turkey, that is the PKK and its offshoot, the Kurdistan Freedom Falcons, to take retaliatory action, ramping up its activities and possibly even starting to target U.S. nationals and interests in Turkey. While the possibility for such attacks certainly cannot be ruled out completely, though there are several important factors that mitigate the threat, along with indicators that the PKK's ability to engage in such activities in Turkey is largely diminished at this time. And let's take a look at why that is. First, there have been several occasions over the past year and a half where developments related to Turkish military operations in Syria raised concerns over a retaliatory increase in PKK terror attacks within Turkey. However, no such rise in PKK strikes has ever materialized, suggesting that the group's assets may be largely bogged down in defensive operations in Syria and/or under significant pressure by the heavy presence of government forces in traditional Kurdish strongholds inside of Turkey. There's another factor is that there has been a significant increase in the numbers of Turkish military forces in the nation's largely Kurdish southeastern provinces since Turkey's first foray into Syria in 2016 with Operation Euphrates Shield. Now, this buildup has made it very difficult for PKK militants to operate as freely as they had in the past. And the launch of Operation Fountain of Peace has brought even larger numbers of Turkish troops to that part of the country, putting greater pressure on Kurdish militants in those provinces. Furthermore, Turkey's Ministry of Internal Affairs is also engaged in an anti-terror effort codenamed Operation Kiran, which it launched in late August. Now, this operation currently consists of 3 prongs across the country's southeastern provinces, and its mission is to locate and destroy militant weapons and supply caches, as well as to capture and/or kill PKK insurgents. It's quite an operation. It involves thousands of special police and gendarme personnel with air and armor vehicle support. And the operation appears to be succeeding in further deteriorating PKK capabilities in the area. And one other consideration when we're talking about the potential for increased PKK activity is the Turkish intelligence and security agencies are really quite effective in dealing with terror groups, particularly since they have wider operational latitude, as they're not constrained by many of the legal restrictions imposed on intelligence and security agencies in the US, UK, Canada, and say Western European countries. Now, the PKK and the Kurdistan Freedom Falcons have been known to strike outside of their southeastern stronghold region and in major cities in Western Turkey, such as Ankara and Istanbul. However, no major terror incidents have occurred in Western Turkey since January 2017, which I think is further testament to how effective the Turkish security forces are dealing with them currently. That being said, again, we can't rule this type of thing out, but the Turkish provinces with the highest potential for PKK activity include Hakkari, Siirt, Diyarbakir, Bingöl, Tunceli, Şırnak, and Şanlıurfa. Okay, now let's move on to another potential concern, and that is any possibility of cross-border spillover or escalation of the hostilities. Now, the deployment of Syrian government troops and some of their Russian allies to support the Kurds in Syria's northeast does present a real potential that Turkish forces may come in direct confrontation with Syrian and Russian units, in addition to the Kurds, of course. But their presence is really unlikely to cause the Turks to back off. Turkish President Erdogan has a vested interest in Operation Fountain of Peace succeeding, and he's got a lot to lose if it fails. Nevertheless, the likelihood of any cross-border incursion into Turkey by Syrian government forces or Russian troops is really extremely low, because such a move would carry an unacceptable risk given Turkey's NATO membership. Any cross-border attacks will likely remain limited to sporadic, low-level Kurdish artillery fire on Turkish towns very close to the border. And we've seen a number of those already, and they've all been on towns right at the border. Now, such attacks are unlikely realistically to impose a significant threat to southeastern population centers further from the border, such as Gaziantep, Şanlıurfa, or Diyarbakir. Okay, moving along, something that could be a broader ramification is the possibility for civil unrest. Now, the most likely fallout in Turkey will be in the form of sporadic civil unrest rather than terrorism or military retaliation. But, you know, even this will be more limited than widespread. There is some degree of anti-war sentiment in Turkey, But the truth be known, this is far eclipsed by the popular support for Operation Fountain of Peace and the patriotic sentiment that's currently at a bit of a high. So given this situation, primary opposition players that could typically muster large numbers of supporters for mass demonstrations, such as the Republican People's Party, CHP, or some of the larger labor confederations, are going to tread very lightly in order to avoid appearing unpatriotic to the populace as a whole. Nevertheless, smaller political, student, and civil society groups who oppose the Erdogan administration will probably stage some anti-war protests in various cities across the country, primarily in the southeast, but also in some of the major Western metropolitan areas, including Ankara, Istanbul, and Izmir. Now, the impact from such actions would primarily be from associated travel and transport disruptions locally. However, clashes can also occur near the sites of protests. We need to keep in mind, of course, and as anyone who's been to Turkey understands already, Turkish police are quick to resort to the use of force, primarily tear gas and water cannon, to disperse even small demonstrations by anti-government activists. All right, another point that we want to look at here and bear in mind is the potential for transport and supply chain disruptions impacting operations. Now, organizations with operations in southeastern Turkey will probably face some degree of transportation and supply chain disruptions. Now, these will be primarily due to any number of security restrictions that may be imposed in order to facilitate troop movements and/or the Ministry of Internal Affairs' ongoing operations against the PKK in that region of the country. Now, Turkish authorities often impose so-called special security zones. These are essentially provisional closure areas when they feel that the local security conditions warrant it. Now, such zones are typically declared with less than 24 hours advance notice, and they're usually enforced for 2 weeks at a time, although they can be extended indefinitely. Now, one special security zone is currently enforced along the Turkish-Syrian border between the towns of Kalkamış in Gaziantep province and Cizre in Şanlıurfa province. And that extends 5 kilometers or about 3 miles from the border into Turkish territory. There are also some others currently in place at various locations in a number of other southeastern provinces. And disruptions from these types of measures can range from moderate to high, depending on the location. In other words, the proximity of the zone to urban areas where deliveries need to be made, or along main thoroughfares, main transport routes, et cetera, et cetera. Now, that's pretty much an overview of how things look. And in closing, let me summarize by saying that the impact of the current military operation in Syria, that the current military operation in Syria will have within Turkey will largely remain localized to the southeastern provinces and areas closer to the border in particular. Now, day-to-day life and business operations in other parts of the country should remain largely unaffected, especially for organizations having no operations in or supply chains transiting the southeastern provinces. But, of course, aside from the security aspects of this situation, which have really been the main focus of this session, there is the potential for tit-for-tat economic sanctions that we have been hearing about lately between Turkey and other nations. That still looms. But as yet, we feel that it's a bit too early to gauge what the exact impact of those may be in the future. Okay, and thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Jim. Next, we'll be hearing from Tony Roccaforte. Tony works as a senior security advisor with WorldAware's Global Assistance and Response team. Prior to joining Global Assistance and Response, he was a senior intelligence analyst focused on political violence and armed conflict. Tony is going to discuss precautions for organizations and their employees operating in the region. Tony?
Thanks, Mary, and thanks to Jim as well. I'm going to focus specifically on basic security recommendations and preparedness tips for organizations and their travelers operating in Turkey. But if your organization is operating in Syria and you have any questions regarding security or operational recommendations in Syria, feel free to contact us after this briefing. As Jim discussed, we will likely see an increase in Turkish security operations in the southeastern provinces along the border with Syria. So with that, the potential for an uptick in sustained insurgent activity in these areas is also possible. But again, with the increased Turkish military presence in the region, militants' freedom of movement will likely be limited. Nevertheless, WorldAware is advising against travel to Turkey's immediate border areas within 20 kilometers or 12 miles of Syria. An uptick in insurgent activity elsewhere in Turkey is also possible, but outside of the southeastern provinces, particularly in the immediate border areas, militant attacks will likely be sporadic, involving small caliber weapons and low yield explosives, and most will be contained relatively quickly. Nevertheless, and this guidance applies anywhere in the world, if you do find yourself in the vicinity of any kind of hostile event, leave the area immediately, as the potential for secondary explosives or complex coordinated attacks is always possible. Understand the difference between cover and concealment. Cover stops bullets and fragmentation. Concealment only screens your position from view. So use cover as much as possible and concealment only if no cover is available. If you're inside at the time of a hostile event, move away from windows and doors and exterior walls if possible. As Jim alluded to, an increase in protest activity throughout Turkey is also likely, but again, police response to any kind of civil unrest in Turkey, especially in major population centers, will be swift and very aggressive. Regardless, if your organization has travel to Turkey coming down the pipeline, make sure all trips are being tracked properly. All contact information for personnel, their hotels, transportation providers, and local points of contact should be collected, validated, and stored for easy access. Additionally, ensure that all travelers are registering their trips with their diplomatic missions in Ankara. If you have sat in on these briefings before, you know that I'm always preaching about robust communications plans. When developing a communications plan, we should always be thinking PACE: primary, alternate, contingency, and emergency. A pro tip here: 4 iPhones using the same cell network is not a PACE plan. So make sure you have multiple forms of communication spanning multiple networks and frequency bands. A solid communications plan should also include an emergency comms or no comms plan if electronic devices are disabled or ineffective for whatever reason. A no comms plan should include procedures for face-to-face check-ins if designated electronic communication windows are missed, as well as escalation procedures for reaching out to a traveler's emergency contacts or next of kin. Make sure that all personnel traveling to Turkey have received intelligence and safety briefings prior to departure. This applies on the backside of trips as well. So liaise with WorldAware and trusted local contacts for updates on the situation, and verify onward transportation before checking out of their accommodations on the backside of trips. Employees before departure should have a solid itinerary in hand, detailed to the hour if possible. Security managers should be notified of any major changes to these itineraries immediately. And travelers should also ensure that at least one trusted associate or family member is aware of their itinerary. Travelers should ensure that emergency contact information and medical information, blood type, known allergies, required medications, insurance numbers, etc., is all recorded in their traveler profile, and that copies of passports, identification, and other important documents are up to date and stored in a safe location, preferably with a trusted colleague or family member. Travelers should avoid discussing their itinerary with strangers or in public spaces, and practice good cyber hygiene as well to avoid broadcasting movements on social media platforms. The traveler's local points of contact in Turkey, to include drivers, should be vetted and verified. All ground transportation should be coordinated well in advance, and photos and contact information of all local drivers, as well as their vehicle make and tag numbers, should be communicated to employees well before any travel to the region. All routes should be pre-planned as well. and travelers should ensure that they're tracking their location at all times. Don't rely entirely on your drivers to do this for you. Understand where you are at all times in relation to where you need to be. So study local maps and make mental notes of alternate routes, as well as possible safe havens, hotels, hospitals, shopping centers, coffee shops, etc., along each route. However, note that in these kinds of dynamic environments, we want to avoid lingering near security checkpoints and government buildings, as well as near the main entrances of hotel lobbies and other easily accessible and crowded areas. On the ground, travelers should vary their daily routines so they don't establish a detectable pattern. Not only multiple routes to and from, but use different entrances and exits into buildings, and vary arrival and departure times as well. When you're moving, constantly scan your surroundings, understand what normal looks like in your immediate vicinity so you can quickly identify any deviations from that baseline. Run through scenarios in your head constantly. We always want to be thinking, if A, B, and C happens, then I'm going to do X, Y, and Z. And then finally, carry a small go bag with you at all times. Ideally, a go bag is part of your everyday carry already, regardless of your operating environment, but it's especially important to have on hand if you're traveling in dynamic environments. At a minimum, go bags need to have all key identification, important contact information, and travel documents, to include an exit visa if applicable, credit cards and cash, enough to sustain you for at least 96 hours. Any required medication with your physician's prescription, if applicable, extra communication devices and power supplies, high energy snacks, bottled water, water treatment, a flashlight with extra batteries, and perhaps some rain gear. Personnel in Turkey also should take time to review and validate local emergency response or emergency action plans, and incident management plans, to include any shelter in place or evacuation plans, and, as mentioned previously, communications plans. At the organizational level, security managers and crisis management teams should consider reviewing and validating business continuity plans and crisis management plans as well. If you don't have any of these plans in place, now is as good a time as any to start drafting them. The next slide is just a snapshot of some of the items I've covered in the last few minutes. The checklist is by no means exhaustive. Checklists rarely ever are, but this makes a good reference for travel planning purposes, and we can make this available to clients upon request, just to help you work in your travel planning through your travel planning. Thanks for your time.
Thank you, Jim and Tony, and thank you everyone for listening into our briefing. If you would like to learn more, visit us at www.worldaware.com.